It's July 27th, 1914. Everyone is going about their daily lives as usual. People are going to work, children are going to school, people are enjoying their European vacations. Little did they know that by the next day, July 28th, 1914, that the world would soon be at war. By August 3rd, a German schoolgirl was writing in her diary that she and her classmates were forbidden from using French words in the classroom. And by the 6th, she and her fellow classmates and others in her family were passing out supplies to soldiers on their way to the front. In less than a week, all of Germany had been militarized. Homes, schools, and streets have been militarized and purposed for the war. Hi, my name is Justin, aka Ghost Reader, and today I'm going to be talking about civilians in the First World War. This video is part of my video series on remembering the First World War, and you can find links to the other videos in the description box below and also at the end of this video. For the information presented in this video, I've read Civilians in the World at War, 1914 and 1918 by Tammy M. Proctor. So what was life like for civilians in World War I? It was definitely different from any other war before. This was a total war. The whole nation was focused on winning the war. And while there have been total wars in the past, World War I basically was reaping the fruits of the Industrial Revolution. All the decades of innovation and all the factories that have been built. And now you had armies where you had millions of men on the battlefield and not just thousands or hundreds of thousands of men. Now all these men needed to be supplied with food and with weapons, and this is where civilians came in. Their most important contribution to World War I was their labor. Millions of civilians did their part. Both men, women, and children did their part in the labor effort. So what did they do? So they worked in things like agriculture, industry, policing, the civil service, anything that could help advance their country's cause to winning the war. So in rural areas, they focused on making sure that the civilians were getting the harvest out, because the harvest was important because you not only needed food for the people fighting, you also needed food for the nation itself. And this food issue will become a big thing for a lot of these countries, and I'll talk about that in more detail later in this video. If you were in the urban setting, then you were trained for first aid, you were put into factories to work, and you also were put to clerical duty because those duties had to be done as well. Women also played a big part in this labor contribution to the First World War. When the war first started, they signed up as nurses, aides, and to charitable and humanitarian organizations. And as the war went on and more men began to go to the front, women were brought into the factories, like munitions factories, to basically make up for the shortage of numbers. So a lot of women moved from basically doing like things like garments, making garments in the garment factory, to munitions plants to make shells and bullets for the soldiers at the front. So there was always a constant demand for more laborers. So if you had colonies like England and France did, you had the luxury of dipping into your colonies. So places like South Africa, Egypt, Indochina, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and you could ask for laborers, and they did indeed send laborers to France and England to help in the war effort. China, who also joined on the side of the Entente, also sent laborers to England and France as well. So places like Germany and also Hungarian Empire did not have this luxury. Even though Germany did have colonies in Africa, because of the Allied blockade, they couldn't get the manpower that they needed. So instead, they basically used forced labor, deporting people from places that they occupied back to Germany in order to work in their factories, conscientious objectors, which also people like France and England did as well, forced conscientious objectors to work, and also POWs. So for a lot of civilians, they worked long hours in the factories in order to support their men fighting at the front. However, that wasn't every civilian's experience. Some civilians lived where the battles were actually happening or nearby, and they shared in the psychological experience that some of the soldiers did. These civilians experienced what has been called the 7 spheres of civilian suffering. 1. Wounding, killing, and suffering. 2. Sexual violence and rape. 3. Spatial suffering such as deportation and forced labor. 4. Impoverishment. 5. Famine and disease. 6. Emotional suffering. And 7. Post-war suffering. So these civilians living near the front lines were exposed to a lot. They were exposed to soldiers taking over their houses and using them as they saw fit, and if the soldiers were particularly bad, using people in their houses as they saw fit. Of course, this led to these people being impoverished because they've lost where they live. They probably have lost their livelihood, and these people would be susceptible to having no food. And of course, when you don't have good food or the right foods or right nutrition, this could lead to disease and death. And of course, all of this together comes together to cause huge psychological and emotional strain for a lot of these people. And for a lot of them, and for other civilians as well, the suffering did not end when the war ended. After the war, Europe was not suddenly just a peaceful, calm place. A lot of people ended up being caught up in civil wars and revolutions, which caused even further displacement and death and suffering as well. Now, for those who weren't at the front lines or near the front lines, say they were a bit further away, say in England or the United States, or even in Paris and other parts of France and Germany, also Hungarian Empire or Russia, that weren't directly affected by the war but were participating and contributing to it, things changed for them as well. Most governments enacted emergency measures and laws to basically have more control over the population in this time of warfare. Basically, some censored the press, some got rid of trial by jury, and this was all to deal with people who they thought would be causing trouble at home. Say, for example, in the United States, German Americans were looked on very suspiciously because their loyalties may lie with Germany rather than the United States. Actually, spy mania in a lot of countries was very big, and actually in the United States, people were actually killing the German shepherds mainly because they were German shepherds. And also when the war started, a lot of people were in different countries on basically vacations. I mean, it was the middle of summer when the war started, and that was like peak tourist season. So you could be like an Englishman taking a vacation in Germany, and suddenly the war starts, and now you could be considered an enemy alien in Germany, or you could be a German in France, or German in England, or German in the United States, and suddenly you're an enemy alien. And what happened to you most likely was you were interned in internment camps. And now, while these internment camps weren't like the concentration camps that we saw in World War II, they could have varying types of conditions depending on where you were held and who you were. Now, a very important part of being a civilian was how your government dealt with food and with rationing of different supplies. So as the war went on, countries of course were affected because resources that they normally got from other countries, they probably weren't getting as much or any at all. And this is because against the Central Powers, the Allies had a blockade, and the Germans were using their U-boats to sink merchant ships coming across the Atlantic, taking supplies from neutral countries to Britain or France. And also, even if you were a country who was not part of the war, you could be affected. Say, for example, Sweden used to get their wheat from Germany and Russia, and of course, as the war went on, that became harder for those countries to export wheat to Sweden. So all these different countries have many different ways of approaching it. Some began rationing earlier than others. Germany in 1915 began rationing bread, while Britain, on the other hand, didn't really start rationing until 1918. And if you could have an effective blockade or effectively stop certain supplies such as food or things like soap or coal from getting to a country, you could have a huge effect not only on the war effort but also on the lives of civilians in the countries in which you wanted to target. So, for example, in Germany in 1916-1970, the winter there was really bad, and also a poor harvest caused what was called the Turnip Winter, where basically there's a shortage of potatoes, and many Germans were forced to eat turnips instead. Some foods disappeared completely off the shelves or had substitutes that were put in place instead of them. So, for example, in replacement of wheat, there was rye and corn millet. In the Ottoman Empire, in Anatolia, Syria, and Lebanon, there was a famine which caused the death of 1.5 million people. Now, for places a bit further away from the war, like America, the United States, they didn't really have an issue that bad, but the American government did ask people to limit things that they did use. So, for example, Americans were asked on certain days not to buy fuel. They were asked not to eat foods on certain days, basically to sacrifice having certain foods or certain amenities so that surplus could be used for the war. And in America and in other places, this was policed mainly by your neighbors. So if your neighbors saw you going to get fuel on a day where you weren't supposed to, or that gas station was supposed to be closed, the neighbors usually step in and call you out and use basically social pressuring in order to force you to follow what everyone else was doing. In England, this social pressure was also seen with women walking around and putting white feathers on men who they deemed were shirking their duty by not being at the front. But not having enough food or the amenities that you used to have was not the only thing that civilians had to worry about, even though they were not at the front. Some people were caught up in air raids on civilian cities, which both sides did during the war. Some people were caught up in explosions from munitions factories, and also on passenger ships crossing the ocean. You could be torpedoed by a submarine and never see it coming. Now, the air raids, of course, led to the creation of air raid shelters, blackout curtains, and painting windows black in order to keep from being a target. So as you can see, the civilian experience in World War I could be a very profound one. You could be on the front line supplying soldiers with housing, or you could be in an internment camp. You could be on the ship at the wrong time. You could be in the factory working long hours, or you could simply be at home worried about the fact that you can't buy pork on a Thursday. In any case, these civilians sacrificed and gave parts of themselves, their time, and their effort to ensure that their country had what it needed to win the war. If you like this video, please hit the thumbs up. If you want to see more videos from me, please subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter at GhostReads28 and also on Goodreads. The link to that is in the description box below. So as always, keep reading.